Sup y'all, and welcome to Industrialization and Global Integration Unit 5, Part 11. In this video, we're going to continue looking at the Age of Imperialism and focus primarily on the continent of Africa. Now, to fully understand the Scramble for Africa, we have to look at the Berlin Conference that went from 1884 to 1885. Now, this conference regulated European colonization and trade in Africa during the Age of Imperialism, and was the formalization of the Scramble for Africa. Many European states met in Berlin, however, no Africans were invited. It was organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, largely to prevent war. You see, the Europeans could dominate the Africans with relative ease, but if they fought against each other, they would ultimately expend a great deal of resources and needlessly lose thousands of lives. Bismarck also sought to preserve the balance of power in Europe that he had worked so tirelessly to achieve. Boundaries were negotiated and colonial territories were delineated, and a system of effective occupation was established, where European states could acquire rights over colonial lands only if they actually possessed them. They actually condemned the slave trade and sought to eliminate it completely, although this excuse was largely used to legitimize European claims in the region. In addition to carving up the territories for themselves, the Europeans established free trade regions along the Congo and Niger rivers. As you can see, the Congo River and the Niger River. This was done for the ultimate purpose of acquiring vast amounts of natural resources and shipping them to the European factories and markets. In the late 1800s, the African continent was transformed from a region of vast native territorial autonomy with some foreign control on the coasts to a region dominated by Europe and only two major independent areas. Liberia, on the west coast, had been established as a state for freed slaves years earlier, and Ethiopia, to the east, was the only African state that successfully fought off European occupation and retained its independence. Now, this will be discussed later on. Although the Europeans did bring some positive changes, such as better technology in medicine, food production, and transportation, the Africans were often exploited for their natural resources and were used as very cheap labor, often uprooting them from their traditional lives. Perhaps no African imperialist story was more tragic than what had occurred in the Congo Free State, a true contradiction in terms if there ever was one. King Leopold II of Belgium personally owned the colony beginning in 1885, and he used it as a source of ivory, rubber, and minerals. He convinced the international community that he was involved in humanitarian and philanthropic work, and gained territory in now what is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, an area about 75 times larger than Belgium. Unfortunately, the people were brutally treated, and many died due to hard labor, starvation, and diseases such as smallpox and sleeping sickness. Sometimes, laborers who failed to meet collection quotas would have one of their hands cut off. It is arguably the worst example of imperialism and greed, as up to 8 million of the 16 million Congolese died from 1885 until Leopold was forced to relinquish his control of his so-called rubber regime in 1908, ultimately turning it over to the government and making it the Belgian Congo. As stated previously, the Africans didn't take European imperialism sitting down. Long-established African nations and kingdoms usually defended themselves, yet were overwhelmed by European technological superiority. The one major exception was with the Christian nation of Ethiopia. Now, they had modernized their country in the 1800s, building roads, bridges, schools, and equipping their army with French and Russian-made weapons. As the imperialist countries of Europe ravaged throughout Africa, an anti-Western national fervor spread throughout Ethiopia, and Emperor Menelik II raised an army of over 100,000 troops, just in time as the Italian invaders made their way into Ethiopian territory in an effort to connect their colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland. As you can see, the Ethiopian troops represented a mix of modern and traditional fighting forces. In 1896, the two sides met and fought at the Battle of Ottawa, ending in a decisive Ethiopian victory, and proving the Africans were not entirely defenseless. Now, South Africa was a multinational region. There were two Boer republics, consisting of the descendants of the original Dutch settlers back in the 1600s. Now, Boer means farmer in Afrikaans,
which is the Creole language of the Afrikaners, who are basically synonymous with the Boers. There were the British, who looked to expand in their territory, and of course, there were the Africans, who had been there since antiquity. What really changed the fate of South Africa was the discovery of diamonds and gold in the latter 1800s. One of the most renowned imperialists was Cecil Rhodes, who arrived at South Africa as a sickly little boy and sent there for the climate. As an adult, he founded the diamond company De Beers in 1888. Today, De Beers markets around 40% of the world's diamonds. While that's impressive, decades ago, they controlled around 90% of the world market. This 1892 caricature of Cecil Rhodes shows him standing as the Colossus of Rhodes, after announcing plans for a telegraph line from British-held Cape Town in South Africa up to Cairo in Egypt. Rhodes was a staunch supporter of imperialism and British superiority. Referring to the African colonies, he once stated, "All of these stars, these vast worlds that remain out of reach, if I could, I would annex other planets." Eventually, the competition for the land resulted in the Boer War that waged from 1899 to 1902, pitting the British against the Boer republics. Eventually, the British won in 1902, expanding their hold on southern Africa. However, in 1910, Britain gave a measure of self-rule to the Afrikaner white minority, forming the Union of South Africa. To conclude, we'll look at the impact of empire on Africa. Now, Europeans upended the traditional farming practices of many Africans and turned their pastures into plantations that produce cash crops, making the Africans more dependent on the mother country. And Europeans imposed taxes to be paid in cash, forcing the Africans to work for wages. And mass production forced many women to give up weaving and tend to the fields, while also maintaining their traditional domestic duties. European teachers and missionaries brought formal education and religion to Africa, and modern political and judicial institutions were also brought to Africa. Technology truly connected and changed the region forever, allowing some Africans to gain great wealth, while also spreading epidemics like never before. Even though they were connected through technology, the new political borders often divided them, establishing a land that is still largely lost from the riches of the modern world.
Recent polls have shown a fifth of Americans can't locate the U.S. on a world map. Why do you think this is?
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, like such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere like such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our children.
Thank you very much, South Carolina.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.